giving voice to a more just and sustainable world since 1979. WMNF Tampa, where music, news, and culture collide.
Hey, investors, donate your appreciated stocks to WMNF and hit a triple play. Support local radio, forego capital gains taxes, and fuel community voices. Contact your broker to turn your market gains into musical magic.
Different on purpose.
You are tuned to WMNF Radio 88.5 FM. This is the public affairs program called Community Speaks. I'm your host, Patro Mabili, and there's a lot, of course, to talk about. As usual, next hour, of course, we're going to get back to the music. But right now, as we approach closer to Inauguration Day for the president-elect, the economy continues to be our focus. We have seen the potential chaos of the next administration with the trillion-dollar man, Elon Musk, testing his influence on Congress. And despite floating misinformation about what was in the first budget bill since the election, President Joe Biden signed the bill passed after the deadline Friday, and it prevented a government shutdown. But today I will share what some organizations are doing to combat misinformation. As we have seen, misinformation is not only a threat to democracies, but agents of misinformation threaten everything. The threat of tariffs, the fight against inflation, the independence of the Federal Reserve, and the economic response to pandemics has continued to worry many people. And the focus on the economy continues as I welcome David R. Kotok joining us today on Community Speaks. He publishes the Kotok Report. It is always an eye-opening and sobering look at the world of economics and politics. He is co-founder and chief investment officer at Cumberland Advisors. Hopefully he can stay with us for most of the hour today as we welcome him to Community Speaks, and you to also join us to call us here on the program throughout the course of today, this hour. And you can also write us at dj at wmnf.org, dj at wmnf.org. And so we're going to go straight away and start talking to David today because there's so much to cover. And, thank you, David, for joining me here on Community Speaks.
Petro, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, and I just wondered, before the election, many in the main were openly concerned about the echoes of history and the rise of fascism after the election. Many were openly highlighting what they are seeing as a growing, all-powerful, wealthy oligarchy on the rise in the United States. And your pre-election report itemized that history, but now such fears of fascism fell on enough deaf ears, and so here we are. Where are you now post-election in terms of where we are?
Well, I don't know where anyone else is. We can always speculate about that. But I'm watching, as most folks around the world are, to see how the new administration unfolds. And what we have seen may be acceptable or may be very distressing. Let me give you, if we have a minute,
yes,
an example of each one.
Okay.
We have a proposal for the senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, to become a member of the cabinet, leave the U.S. Senate, and have a very high-profile position in the United States government. And there seems to be no objection to that appointment.
Right.
He has experience in world affairs. He is a conservative, but this is a conservative administration and a conservative structure. So if you set aside the politics of I'm a Democrat, I'm an independent, I'm a Republican, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, whatever, you look at a proposed appointment like Rubio and you say, this is a thoroughly vetted, known, former political adversary of Trump, who is going to emerge in a major position and is very likely to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Hard to see that won't happen.
Right.
I would score for the Trump administration. That's the type of appointment that you would say that's an A. Now, you may not like or dislike the politics or cultural politics of conservative versus liberal or MAGA versus woke or whatever. But you have to say the appointment is a satisfactory appointment from all that we know. Contrast that to the proposed appointment of Getz, another elected legislator, now no longer in the House of Representatives, and say, my gosh, that was a complete disaster. And the revelations in the last 24 hours, when the report from the House of Representatives is now out in the public domain, even though Getz attempted litigation to suppress it. It didn't go anywhere. It's out. It's leaked. Now, let's set aside the name Rubio and set aside the name Getz and say we have two elected Republican members of the nation's legislature, the Senate and the House, and the Trump transition team and the Trump organizational team proposed both of them. And you could say, well, I give one an A and one an F. So I back away from the specifics of Getz, who I do not like. His behavior has been awful in the House of Representatives. In my opinion, he is a disruptor and a troublemaker, and now we know more about him. And Rubio, I may disagree with him on policies, but he's a seasoned, known person in the United States Senate. Two personalities. I back away from the two of them and I say, what is the process inside Mar-a-Lago that offers the United States a Rubio and a Getz? There's the question. What's the process? And we don't know. So we have no idea what's coming at us tomorrow.
Right. Now, do you think that's part of the game here, is to keep people guessing so that we can't anticipate his moves?
I don't think it's part of a game. I think we know we've had 4 years of Trump elected as a president. He was elected. I think he was surprised that he actually won.
Yeah.
He was surprised that he advanced as far as he did in the primaries, and he was not taken seriously. And I remember when Chris Christie, who was at the time involved with Trump and supported him, and Chris Christie's former governor of New Jersey, has Republican credentials, as we know. And Christie went to Trump and said, you need a transition team. You might actually win this damn thing. And Christie starts to put together a transition team. And of course, Trump now wins. His son-in-law says to Trump, I don't want Christie. He put my father in jail. And the transition team blows up, and they had to do it all over again. So Trump won. Chaos in the beginning. no structure, no plan. Now Trump loses. Biden has an operational structure, and not only does Trump lose, but he's never admitted he's lost.
Right.
So you have all the behaviors of chaotic activity, and now Trump wins again. This time around, there is the rollout of very well-constructed organization, not the chaos we saw in Trump 1.0. Trump 2.0 has had a lot of process. What I noticed from the Getz versus Rubio comparison is that process internally is not clearly glued together. There's a chief of staff. She's supposed to be very good, Susan Wiles, and she didn't know when Trump announced Getz, or at least that's what we were told. We don't know who. If you're not in the room, you don't know the truth,
Right.
but you know what you're told. So we face uncertainty, and part of the uncertainty is this question about organizational structure, policy consistency, and the message that goes with it. And there is a mixed message, which is why we have the uncertainty we do.
Right. And I just got the feeling earlier on that the president-elect was not really engaged that much in the transition, that these were people, as long as they were loyal to him, but it looks like there was a cabal of people who are around making these decisions and they're handing out these jobs to these characters that they feel are going to push the party line, I suppose, the MAGA party line. I mean, we have the World Wrestling Federation nominee from the World Wrestling Federation who's going to be at education. I mean, it doesn't seem like he's really that engaged or involved in that. This is a cabal of people who are just handing out jobs to their friends.
This is a very difficult thing to absorb when you have the construction of who do you want to occupy an important position. I think of Kennedy and healthcare, an example of a very controversial appointment. So you could have a view about vaccines, you could agree with it, you could disagree with them. We have a divide in the country when it comes to vaccines coming off of the COVID pandemic, and that's not unusual. I mean, my new book, which is coming out in February, focuses on epidemics, pandemics, and plagues, and how they introduce diverse and misleading points of view and create disruption. And that's been the case throughout history.
And that's where I want to go right now. Talk about that book, because how are you thinking now about the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how the return of this president, whose first term went down in flames because of his readiness or unreadiness and his response to the pandemic, especially economically?
Well, history is replaying itself, Patrick. We are replaying history, and sadly, we don't learn from it. So we're human. We're not perfect, and we've had experience after experience for almost 4,000 years of recorded history. I have references to all of that in the book, from COVID all the way back to the plague in Athens 2,500 years ago. And what do you see? You change governance forms. There is disruption. There is misleading of people when it comes to disease and pathogens. There's disinformation. There's bad actors who take advantage of the disinformation. So history replayed itself with COVID, just like it did with the Spanish flu. in 1917, 18, 19, 20, 21. It really was a 5-year epidemic. History's replaying itself, and it's doing it right now.
But isn't it all relative? Because, you know, we saw this disruption after COVID when it came to the supply chain, and we saw a president who just doesn't like any problems on his watch, so he called it a hoax, and so we weren't ready. And then there were governors who were not out there every day putting out a report about what governments were doing. And there was some concern that red states were going to reopen before, you know, people were ready. And somewhat the landscape has changed, where workers have gotten used to staying home from the job, and companies are trying to force them back into work. So economically speaking, aren't we in a period of a gamble by going backwards? I mean, history repeats itself, but we saw that we saw what happened in terms of the tanking of the economy. And people said the economy was the important issue during the election. Whether they were being honest or not, it's still an issue. Where do you think is going to happen?
Well, our book looks at what happens in a plague, in an epidemic, in a pandemic, and what happens to the economics during and after. And we examine that with COVID, but we also examine that with previous episodes, wherever we could find historical records. And the process is the same. You have a shock, people die, you have death rates above and beyond the normal trajectory of demographics. You have wages that are shocked. You have all of the elements of this force that is introduced by a disease, by a germ, by a pathogen.
Right.
Then you have the aftermath of the shock, and things are different. And the interesting thing that happens when you have a pandemic, a plague, is that you lose people, but you don't lose capital. The people die. The building doesn't die. The equipment doesn't die. It just changes the system. So in the ancient days, when we were an agricultural society and you had fewer people, what did you do? Well, the first thing you did is you let the least productive field lie fallow because you didn't have to grow as much food. What does that mean? You have fewer people, and your least productive field is taken out, and the productivity of the society that remains goes up. What else happens? Poor people die. Whatever they have, their heirs inherit, but it isn't very much.
Right.
Rich people die. Their heirs inherit a lot. What happens to the whole society? The per capita wealth goes up. When you introduce a shock like that, where productivity per capita goes up and wealth per capita goes up, you have a major shift. This is entirely different than a hurricane or a war or a natural disaster or an earthquake, whatever it happens to be. So we have that shock, and we have the shadow of that shock still with us today. And it will probably be with us for the next 20 years. And here's why. We know about how many people died in the United States. We don't know exactly, but we know we lost 1.5 million people, maybe 2 million people. We don't know exactly, on top of normal age demographics. If you look around the world lost 25 30, 35, 50 million people above baseline demographics, whatever country you were in. So that was a global impact. That global impact now is showing up in the extension of the post-shock period. In the United States, we have somewhere between 9 and 17 million people who are walking around today with long COVID disabilities of one type or another.
Right.
I had dinner with two of them last night, and they have the residual effects of the sickness that they had a year ago. And we were talking about this issue. Well, if you have 5% of your population with some form of post-COVID disability, that's the shadow shock.
Right.
And in economics, we have ways to deal with that. We calculate what happens to people, how productive are they, how many are working, how many are impaired in some form. There's organizations that are focused on this. My worry about this new administration is they don't want COVID. They don't want to have to admit or deal with anything.
Right.
And therefore, they may, we don't know, they're not in office yet, but they may be rejecting in the healthcare arena a massive amount of information. And by rejecting it, they will expose the American society and the rest of the world to additional shocks. That's what we don't know. And the appointments of people who plant doubt and disinformation, misinformation about healthcare is a massive risk. And if I have another minute, I'd like to explain why to your listeners.
Certainly.
The healthcare sector in the United States is 18% of the GDP. 18% of the U.S. economy is devoted. It's the highest percentage. We are the wealthiest nation in the world, and we spend and devote more of our economic total size, whether you measure it by income or you measure it by output. We devote about 18% of the total to our health care. Now, you could argue we're inefficient with it. Yes, we are. We are also providing the world with the results when they're good. 18%. Now, 18% employs millions and millions of people, whether it's the person who assists the janitor at Tampa General or a neurosurgeon or a research oncologist at Moffitt. 18%, millions of people. And this sector, this massive sector of the United States, is now exposed to risk from possible appointees who have been very clear about their intention to disrupt it. They haven't been obscure about it.
Right.
They have been out in front about it. That's what I worry about.
Right.
Number one, I'm a user of the healthcare system. So are you. So are probably everyone who's listening to this show.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, that's a big, big slug of the United States. And some of those people are exposed. If you deport the person who is cleaning the facility in Tampa General Hospital, and they are an invisible employee, but they're in the healthcare system, and that is a very important role, and you deport them or threaten them, you injure the entire healthcare system.
Right.
just as you would if you deported a neurosurgeon. That's my view.
Well, certainly, and we definitely don't need any more worker shortages, especially in the healthcare field. No matter what they're doing, even if it is janitorial work, it's still an important function, especially in a medical facility. So, if there's disinformation and then you take in all of the possibility of deportations and worker shortages across the board, you look at the economic threat of tariffs and a president that seems to really have a misunderstanding of what that could cost. When you look at politically, do you think that a president who sees the stock market as his personal pole will not meddle in the workings of the Federal Reserve, for instance, and just really exacerbate the problem?
Well, I'm a champion of the independence of a central bank.
Yes.
I've written about it, participated in all kinds of activity in my life. I was the chairman of the central banking series of a think tank called the Global Interdependence Center for years. The history is very clear here. The more independent the central bank, the safer the economy is from direct intervention. The more the central bank is placed under the thumb, the direct thumb of the government, the more there is in risk. So, is the central bank perfect? Certainly not. Does it attempt, as an independent central bank, to try to suppress inflation, to try to have a payment system, to try to operate a system? Absolutely yes. The United States and the Federal Reserve have the finest clearing payment system in the world. Now, when I say that in a speech or activity, I get challenged by people. They don't like the rate of inflation. They think the interest rate should be 6% instead of 7% or whatever. And I say, well, let me just ask you to back up for a minute. And do you remember when the World Trade Center was attacked and collapsed? Now, that admittedly, that was 2 decades ago. I happen to have been in the South Tower.
Wow.
When it was attacked. I happened to get out, and I'm fortunate to be alive. So for me, it's a vivid example personally. Let me get back to the central bank. When those towers collapsed, they collapsed on the payment apparatus of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The backup system for the Federal Reserve was the Atlanta Fed. There's an entire redundant system. So the Federal Reserve never goes out of business, and nobody thinks about it. They take it for granted. It's like when your plumbing at home works, you don't think about it. You only think about it when the toilet doesn't flush and backs up. The Atlanta Fed stepped in. And here's the question. The day after the World Trade Center collapsed, did anybody miss a payroll in California? Did a real estate settlement in Florida not happen because the wire transfer didn't get there? Was a check clearing operation in Texas sending money to Minnesota didn't happen? No. The Federal Reserve's finest hour was under the maximum domestic threat that killed 3,000 people in New York. Nobody thinks about the central bank. So I'm a champion of the Federal Reserve. And if you want to compare the policy, do you want the policy like the Weimar Republic in the early 1930s, which led to the collapse of Germany and the rise of Hitler? Do you want the policy to be the the inflation exhaustion of all capital, like we saw in Zimbabwe when Mugabe was the dictator. So, for me, the threat to the independence of the Federal Reserve, which was purposefully designed to avoid political interference. Governors of the Federal Reserve have a 14-year term. There are 7 of them, and they are staggered. And it was set up with 14-year terms on purpose so the term would be longer than the presidential or electoral cycles.
Right.
So I'm more worried about that because that threatens all of our wealth, our money, our investments, everything. So I'm a defender without reservation of the independence of the central bank.
Because without it, you fall to the wishes and the whims of a meddling president, for instance.
Well, and no president, think about this, no president is going to say, we need to raise the interest rate, raise the mortgage interest rate, because the inflation is getting away from us, it's too high. Can you imagine a politician making that statement? So the politicians are biased. There's no neutral. They only go on one side, and their time horizon is the next election.
Right. So we don't need that. But, let me just let everybody know what's going on here. We're talking to David R. Kotok. We're getting a real lesson into the economy and what goes on behind the scenes and beneath the surface, and how that impacts us all, especially when you look at these big events such as pandemics. But, you also write about the through line between the Great Recession, for instance, and what had to be done to protect the economy at that time, and the independence of the bank, of the Federal Reserve at that time helped bail us out of that. Do you think that there's a through line between then and what happened in the pandemic and the fears of the politicians, of the politics that's emerging, especially global, when you have unelected players like Musk running around trying to meddle in elections around the world?
Well, we see it, and this is not new. We have seen that in previous periods in the United States, and we have seen this in other countries. Now, Musk, I won't say Musk is a unique personality, but he is in a position that is highly unusual. He's the wealthiest man in the world, or one of them for sure. And he personally spent over $200 million of his own money in this political campaign, because we are in a system now, ever since Citizens United case was decided, where very wealthy people have ways to participate in political campaigns in the millions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm a voter, you're a voter. We don't have millions.
Right.
You're a politician, and you've got to run a political campaign. Are you going to listen to Packer or David equally with Elon Musk, who gave your campaign $1 million? Who's going to have more influence? And therein lies the issue. Set aside the fact that he's a very large, for good reason, he has successful business operations. He's a very large contractor with the United States government.
Right.
So what do we do in our society in such things? We have a free press. We have a First Amendment that is supposed to protect us. We have freedom of speech. It's supposed to be protected. We litigate in courts. We don't shoot each other, although these days sometimes we do.
Yeah.
You're a public voice in a community. I'm a writer and publish a letter. And we have the ability to criticize our government and to talk about it. I don't want that taken away from me. You don't want it taken away from you. And not one of your listeners wants to lose it. So that's our confrontation. I don't know where this all leads, because the influence of huge amounts of money in political process is a very dangerous thing, and it needs to be ventilated, it needs to be transparent, and then the public has to make decisions about what they see. And these days, you can't be sure about the information you get.
Right.
Because we've got, that's a whole other discussion. It would take us another hour.
Exactly. And, but we've covered quite a bit, and when you look at misinformation, when you look at people who have all of this wealth and influence on the government, and maybe what government actually does for all of us, and we have to worry about what the plans are, what the agenda really is. But when you look at all of the dangers, we've talked about economic crisis, we've talked about the pandemics, and hopefully in your book, the book, by the way, is named The Fed and the Flu, right?
The Fed and the Flu. There is a website now up. The book has a website, one word, www.thefedandtheflu.com. And we have the beginning of some reviews of the book. And within another 3 or 4 weeks, you'll be able to order the book in paperback or hardback or ebook or Kindle. Right now, the only thing you can order is the Kindle version from Amazon, but the rest of that is coming out within a few weeks. And I hope people find it interesting. It's been a project of over 4 years with my co-authors. I have wonderful co-authors who, without them, the book wouldn't have happened. So it's got a lot of good information about the economics and inflation, wages, epidemics, pandemics, the Federal Reserve, and lessons for tomorrow if anybody's willing to read and pay attention.
And it may not be another 100 years before we face another pandemic that we've never seen before. I'm already hearing the possibility of, we've heard of bird flu, but not human-to-human contact. But we have seen a case in Louisiana of a animal-to-human contact, and this human is in the hospital really, really sick. So the response to pandemics, what you do in the face of it and how you handle it economically is an important issue. So I think that is something that, we should all be interested in. But I'm also interested in the global conflagrations, the possibilities of widening war, and how this leadership here after Joe Biden will respond to it.
Well, look, the world looks dangerous to me. The Middle East in various forms and how it's changing. And the issue of Ukraine and Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, and the latest statement out of Putin is, I should have invaded sooner. We're in a dangerous world. Now, you could say, well, you're always in a dangerous world. Well, maybe so. But it just seems more dangerous than before. I really worry about this connection between North Korea and Russia, and Iran, and Hamas, and the Houthis, and Hezbollah, and now, of course, Syria has dismembered. And the Houthis launch rockets at shipping now within 500 or 1,000 miles. So we are rerouting the transit of probably a fifth, maybe a sixth of all global shipping is now not using the Suez Canal, but has to come around at higher costs and longer voyages. I mean, the notion of disruption, terrorism, the weapons that are used, the issue of drones, and how that has changed warfare. All of this is very concerning to anybody who spends the time. In my profession, I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
I would like to go watch to get away from it, but I don't want to have to watch Antique Roadshow all over again. The world doesn't let you be alone, and this world looks more dangerous. Now, what does that do for the defense budget of the United States, which was delayed and delayed and delayed in the Congress? Only just now in this budget fight did we finally give a pay increase to the people who wear uniforms who defend our country. What kind of behavior is that? That's awful.
And that we're using, that was Tuberville, I think, was one senator that was using cultural war issues to keep those a lot of those people in the military from getting their advances and moving up to the higher ranks. It was a lot of disruption going on. But also, let me ask you about, because, we talk about this world being so scary, feeling so scary. I think it feels scarier because of the players like Putin, who has so much influence, and like Trump, who's just all over the place, doesn't seem to really have any idea or any kind of rhyme or reason. He's talking about buying Greenland again. He's talking about eyeing Canada and the Panama Canal. Isn't this, playing with fire to some extent, especially on the Panama Canal?
Well, I've been to the Panama Canal, and it's a marvel of engineering when it was constructed, and a marvel of engineering recently since it was enlarged and widened for different ships. But Panama's a government.
Right.
Independently. Greenland is part of Denmark. So Trump can say, gee, I want to buy Greenland. We should buy Greenland. Well, fine. Number one, how are you going to do it? And number two, how are you going to pay for it?
Right.
Think about the reaction in reverse. We have all this controversy about China. Suppose China said, look, we want to make nice with the United States. We'll buy the Grand Canyon. Would we sell them the Grand Canyon? We'll run a resort and tourism, and we'll give you billions of dollars, and we'll own the Grand Canyon.
No.
Well, what do you think? I mean, it's just silliness in my opinion.
Yeah. But it's a silliness that, he seems to have no concern about what kind of fallout politically that might cause. Maybe he doesn't think it'll cause any fallout. But David Kotok, there's a couple of people on the phone that wants to chime in, probably ask you a couple of questions if you got a few more minutes. Let's see if we can get to the calls.
What do we have? 10 minutes left?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I am happy to do it.
Excellent. Great. Hang on one second. Let's see if we can go to the telephone calls. You can call us 813-239-9663. Or you can write DJ at WMNF.org. You can go to Lakeland and see what Simon has to ask. Go ahead, Simon. You say what?
Hi, good morning, or actually good afternoon. Given the limited time, what I find intriguing as a healthcare provider is that because of the way COVID was treated, there's a dishonesty that many people feel toward the institution of medicine. Let me give you just an anecdotal question, and if you could explain to the listeners. When you watch TV, you'll see Tampa General advertising that they're the leaders in heart surgery, they're the leaders in obstetrics, they're the leaders in OBGYN, and other hospitals are the leaders. You never see a hospital advertising themselves as the leader of treating COVID. There were over 14 or 15 double-digit models for treating COVID internationally. And the president, current administration, withdrew the distribution of monoclonal in the state of Florida and made it political. Why do you feel that the medical institution is not willing to provide to the public the fact that the CDC dictated to doctors and hospitals, and there is a distinction between dying from COVID and dying with COVID, but the CDC took over, and many doctors then quit in hospitals because they chose not to put their patients on ventilators for the financial reimbursement of the hospital institution. You don't see hospitals, call up a hospital and ask them, if I go into the emergency room, can you tell me what your protocol is for COVID?
Okay. David?
So, Simon, we had that situation in Sarasota, which is where my firm is, Cumberland Advisors, and where I live. And we had controversy in Sarasota Memorial Hospital. The post-COVID investigation was very deep, and it was a political turmoil in Sarasota at the time because we still have a publicly elected hospital board, which is answerable to the general public. But the results at the end, I think, exposed that the hospital did the best it could with the information that it had at the time, which wasn't perfect. Now, I can't speak about other hospitals. Sarasota Hospital, Memorial Hospital saved my life, so I have a bias. Granted, in pandemics and epidemics, Simon illustrates the shock. It happened every single time in history. It happened in Spanish flu, happened in the Asian flu, it happened in ancient Rome with Galen as the physician. That's history. That's the way it has always been, and we tend not to learn for the next time, which is why we repeat it, unfortunately.
Which is why I try to continue to have these conversations, because I think the vast majority of us were shocked that people were willing to play fast and loose with information in a public health pandemic. And it shocked me that in the United States, supposed to be the advanced country of the world, some people acted like we were in a backwater. So,
do you want to take another one, Patrick?
Yeah, let's take one more. Go to St. Pete and see what Mike has to ask. Go ahead, Mike. You're on the air.
Hey, I just wanted to mention a couple of things about the last campaign, the last election. But the press allowed Trump to define the issues. So he told us what the issues were going to be, and they ran on them, and the Democrats weren't listening. The Democrats were worried about abstract issues like the threat to democracy, which was real, but it was abstract to the voters because they were worried about the price of groceries. And the Democrats didn't do enough to do something about that. The Biden administration's antitrust division did go after some corporations, but they didn't go after the firms in the food chain, and so the price of food didn't come down. And then Trump himself, in his first interview after the election, admitted that there wasn't anything he could do about the price of food, even though he ran on that. So we're stuck. The press didn't ask the questions, and the Republicans have the big megaphone. And even though the Democrats had a lot of money, they did not respond to the issues phony issues, by the way, that Trump raised. And so that's why the Democrats lost, in my opinion. What's your take on that?
David?
Well, my take on, we have a great country, and I've only got about 2 minutes left, I think. My thought is we have a system. Our system evolved over several hundred years. But we do have a system. Our system elects by the Electoral College. There's always a movement to abandon the Electoral College. There's never enough votes to change it. We have a system prescribed in a constitution. And it's imperfect. And it has been imperfect since the first minute. It got 10 pieces added to it called the Bill of Rights. In the beginning, by the way, the introduction wasn't 10. We just ratified number 11 and number 12 even decades and years later.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So if you say this marvelous experiment in the history of the human being is 250 years old, more or less, and it's evolving. Now, Lincoln asked the question in a speech, will it endure? And it has been tested in wars, in a civil war, in a depression, through various constructions, Republican, Democrat. By the way, those two political parties reversed themselves.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at history, one was a defender of the period of time when there was slavery.
Right.
That's what the Republican Party was born with Fremont in 1856, who lost the election, and Abe Lincoln, who was the first Republican president. So you look at the roles in the evolution in the United States. I want to believe that our political system will endure. I want to believe it. I've dedicated my life to it. I've served my country in a uniform because of it, and I want it for my grandchildren. So I'm a hopeful one. That's where I am, Patrick.
Yeah, well, I want to believe in all that too, and but I think it requires buy-in from everybody, and especially when we're living in a time of misinformation, where that seems to be one of the major issues that we have to confront. David, I want to thank you for joining me here today. I'm going to continue to read that blog because it helps me stamp out misinformation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book, The Fed and the Flu.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And that was David Kotok. Thank you. And thank you for joining me here on Community Speaks. Today, up next, of course, we're going to get back to the music with It's the Music Monday. Blaine Whalen is coming your way. Keep it tuned right here to your community radio station, WMNF.org, WMNF Tampa. This has been Community Speaks. I'm your host, Patrick Mobili. Join me again next week as we continue these discussions. Keep it tuned. Happy holidays. Keep it tuned for the scoop. It's coming your way next, followed by It's the Music Monday.
This is the scoop for Monday.
I'm Sean Canan with the WMNF News headlines. A CBS reporter on X says that CBS News has obtained a final draft of the House Ethics Committee report on Matt Gaetz, which is expected to be released later today. According to CBS, among its findings are that Gaetz violated state statutory rape and illegal drug laws. A federal judge has dismissed a Broward County teen's challenge to the constitutionality of a 2021 Florida law that forbids transgender female students